to December Visualizing Christmas and Visual Storytelling. Does anybody remember the old DataViz logo? Raise your hands. So we've got almost nobody. What do you guys think of this one? Do you like it?
No.
Let me see it. Yeah, you don't like anything.
I don't like anything.
Anything I say, he doesn't like it. Anybody who likes it, put their hand up. It's okay. If you don't like it, I just will take away your gelato. And if you don't like it, you think that something needs to change. One of the comments I've gotten is that the fonts need to change, or they're not quite sure about the outline, the fact that it's an outline of DC, it's not clear. If you think something needs to change, raise your hands.
You need to get a designer, not an engineer designer.
You want to pay for it?
What?
You want to pay for it? You got to volunteer?
I could express my opinion and help you.
I bet you express your opinion.
Depending how much you pay, of course.
How much you pay?
We pay in gelato.
We pay in gelato and visualizations.
I'm allergic to gelato.
So again, thanks for coming. And for those of you who don't know, Washington Post guest, and the password is WashPost. And apologies, I forgot to update this, although that might have been a Freudian slip, because last event was the biggest event that we'd had ever. And if I included this data, you'd actually see a dip in the green line. So I think I forgot on purpose, although not consciously. So it looks like we're still spiking up. In reality, we probably, the next data point would probably be down there. So, excuse me. Well, in terms of RSVPs, we had 200, so it'll be down there. So I need one more data point. We'll smooth everything over, and then it'll look like we're still growing. And of course, DataViz is part of Data Community DC, Data Science, Data Business, Statistical Programming, Data Science Maryland. Data Wranglers will hopefully be joining us soon. And just a little update, thanks to Harlan on some of the overlap. Can everybody see that? That's really, really light. Well, anyway, it just shows some of the overlap between the different groups. Data Sciences, they're the biggest group. They've been around for the longest. Statistical Programming, DC, and DataViz, we're starting to catch up with them, and then the rest. Little Venn diagram. And all the buttons that you've been hitting as you got in here are part of Greg Toth's Internet of Things, and those are his social devices. I'm not sure if socialdevices.io, what happens if I go to that webpage, Greg?
There's a come and send page on it right now.
Okay.
So it's a soft launch, but not hard launch.
Right. So I just love pushing those buttons. It's the best idea ever. Hopefully we can turn that into an actual business. And as we said, the event videos will be on Tony's site. Last time we tweeted those. If you want to be a part of tweeting through Data Community DC, if you volunteered, if you've been an active member, just let me know. We can put you on as part of the list, and anytime you add Data DC, you'll be automatically retweeted through our account. And in general, if you want to get involved, there's being a speaker, there's teaching classes, there's organizing events, being a sponsor, of course. So you've seen Singlifics in the back with their 3D, what do I call that? 3D monitor. The 3D monitor. Anybody put the glasses on in here? We got two guys. Oh, of course, you're his son. Anyway, that thing is really cool. Does anybody here want to blog about this? I believe we should have somebody here from Visually, no? Hey, Allison, right? Allison, thank you for coming. Anybody else feel like writing a blog post about this? Bueller?
Got one back there.
Did we get somebody back there?
Yeah, back there.
Oh, excellent. And of course, cross-promotion and partnership. In general, for sponsorship, it's all about who we reach and the influence that we have. And if you're interested in a targeted group of data scientists, we're the network to go through. And there's myself, John Schwabish, Harlan Harris. Harlan's right over there. John, where are you? I lost you. Oh, you're right in front of me. Or you're behind the boom. And on Thursday is Modem East. It's a partner event. They upped their percent off from 10 to 20% if you use DC Data 13 when you go to their site. So we'll be there, and I'm excited to go over there. Just a quick background about this. When everybody know the organizer with Modem East, he started 3 years ago, and his first event, I actually tried to hijack it. It's when Meetup allowed anybody to put up an event if they felt like it. And I just said, yeah, we should have a new event. And he freaked out because he's trying to turn this into a big business. And he ended up calling me, and that's how we got to know each other. So, and it's kind of interesting, 3 years later, he's got Modem East, and we've built Data Community DC. So it's fun to see these things change over time. And some of our other sponsors, Cloudera, Intridia, ParkMe, Singlifics. Harlan, do you want to say anything about Cloudera and Intridia?
Sure. So Cloudera is a large big data sort of provider. They've been a good supporter in recent months. Intridia is a web development shop, local, and they have recently been doing more stuff with data visualization, dashboards, and so forth. They're hiring. They're also a great resource if you're looking to build some sort of web or mobile app.
And of course, Greg Lynch is kind enough to give us this space with Washington Post. For those who may have been here last time, General Assembly, we still have the scholarship, 2 $500 scholarships for web development and user experience. These classes go for, I think, $1,500 each, so that's a significant discount on them. If you're interested, just come and contact us, tweet us at Data Community DC. Anyway, and we'll let you know about the details. Anybody else have any announcements? John.
Yeah, so I just launched a new website called HelpMeVis. It's a site where people can post visualizations that they're having trouble with, or drafts, or they just want the community to ask for help. It's not a for-profit thing, it's free, it's whatever. So if you have graphs you need help with, you can send them to the site, send them to me, and we'll post them up, and the community will log in and provide comments and feedback.
Great. Is that microphone around anywhere, Greg? And anybody else?
Hey, I'm Michael Shea. We just started a new meetup called Transportation Techies. We're putting on something called Metro Hack Night on January 2nd or Thursday. And so anyone who has any interesting apps or visualizations that involve WMATA, rail, or bus, please join us.
Interesting visualizations on what?
WMATA, buses, or rail. Metro.
Maybe your voice projects, or Tony's going to run.
No, it doesn't project. My name is Tom Neely, and I'm working on a complex network graph visualization. It's a new way of looking at data that we're still collecting. So I'm looking for freelance help with visualization, especially probably with JavaScript, working off a Neo4j database. And so anybody like to talk more about that? Just some freelance help in the visualization. Thanks.
Make sure you talk to me afterwards. I can put you in touch with some people. Anybody else? Mark, you're about to give a whole presentation.
I'm going to give like 2 minutes. Just a job. Marx along with Singlifics for an interactive data visualization startup. We're about 3.5 months old. We're looking for a developer who can help develop usability tools around the visualization engine, as well as business development people who can help us get into retail, financial services, or any other vertical. So, thanks.
Anybody else? Okay. And so last time, General Assembly said that they were going to get us drinks, right? And they did. They brought us across the street. Then we found out we could have had drinks here. Then I made the impression that we were going to have drinks here, and then he got confused because we also did the thing with Data Science DC. General Assembly has one guy organizing everything here in DC. He's a little bit pulled in different directions. He's pulling together a team. He has committed, though, verbally, although I want to take advantage of the guilt trip that he's currently on. He has said verbally that he's willing to provide beer at the upcoming events. Would anybody want to volunteer to make sure and stay on top of him that he brings beer to events? Is everybody interested in being that person? I thought there would be somebody to sign up for that. Oh, I got one. There we go. I got one. All right, Harlan, if you don't mind. All right, thank you. It does take a bit to make sure that we get these things coordinated, because it turns out that there's about a dozen people involved in this event today. And all right, so moving on. So there's this visualizing Christmas thing, right? And what the heck? What is that? What am I talking about? And I announced it, at the last event. I'd only thought of it the day before, or something like that. And I really didn't mean. All these things are very serious. We're going to about to have Robert Crosara, who tours around the country, give a presentation on his research, over the past decade. And I do like that stuff, but I like being a little bit more lighthearted at times. So I asked the community, people who come to these events, to get some data and to create a couple of plots, and we got about 6 interesting things. So I want to give special thanks to Will, John, Ryan, Mark, Jessica, Ben, Lisa, Chris, and John. Not everybody's here. Mark just gave his announcement. John? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for, did you find that data set on the birth rates?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're going to like that. And then Ryan did a lot of the hacking for it. And I don't believe, is Ben here? Okay, I'm just going to present his stuff for him. And no, Lisa's not here. All right, of course John isn't. So I had to put this one up here, though. So I've been really interested in Santa Claus for a while. Right, and you're a little kid and you find out that it's not actually real. But there was some work by this gentleman here, Roger Highfield. He created The Physics of Christmas. It's a book. And if you go to the visually Santa DataVis, it'll go through a bunch of statistics about just how fast Santa has to travel, how much stuff he has to carry, how many joules of energy he creates through friction in the atmosphere as he travels, how many visits he does per second, that sort of thing. And, well, I had a conversation. Roger actually lives in London, so it was interesting trying to coordinate with him. But we had a conversation, and we talked about, and I don't know if there's anybody here that's French. Does anybody know how to pronounce that?
What?
Alcubierre warp technology? Alcubierre? Alcubierre.
Yeah, Alcubierre.
So between Santa and Alcubierre, you have warp technology, right? Now, Alcubierre is serious. He actually took general relativity equations and went backwards with them. So usually you go forwards. You start off with a massive body like the Earth or the Sun, and you figure out how it warps space-time around you, right? Well, he went in the other direction, and he said, well, what if I wanted to warp space-time in this particular way? What type of matter would I need? And could I create a warp drive? Now, if anybody's ever gone surfing or anything like that, that should look familiar. That literally is just a wave. It's just that in this particular case, it's warping space-time instead of warping water. But the principles all work out to be the same. And it turns out the type of matter that you need is some exotic matter that I think it has like a negative energy density. That seems ridiculous, except that it wasn't long ago that we'd never heard of a negative index of refraction. So you see, anybody ever see James Bond from years ago where he had that invisible car? Remember where it was in the ice and it was with the, eventually they shot it and it didn't work anymore? That car had a negative index of refraction. So at one point they thought something like that was impossible. So is exotic matter and negative energy densities impossible? All it really probably means is that we'll learn something about space-time, and that's what will end up warping things. And who says that Santa hasn't already figured that out? And then Valerie was kind enough to provide some recipe searches for both Christmas and for New Year's. Valerie, do you want to say anything? You want to grab the mic? You're going to be shy? Yeah. No, you're not going to be shy. Give her the mic. Come on.
All right, so these are actually the ingredients and title keywords from blog posts created by thousands of bloggers. And I analyzed over 300,000 recipes to find what keywords and ingredients trend at Christmas time and again at New Year's. So the top one is candy cane, and other popular ones are eggnog, chocolate peppermint, Christmas, of course, gingerbread, etc. So
Oh, you want to go to
that's
the
all I
next
have to
one?
say about that one. There's a lot there. And if you look at the next.
Well, how did you compare the data in order to pull that out?
Oh, okay, so I took the frequencies that each of these terms occurred in the first 25 days of December, because bloggers like to push the season. So they start right after Thanksgiving, they start the Christmas recipes. And then I compared that to the average frequency they occur throughout the year. And so these are the ones that have the highest frequency during December compared to their frequency during the rest of the year.
And then this is the same thing for New Year's.
Right, same thing for New Year's. I wanted to see like diet and detox, and that's in there. It didn't trend quite as big, but the name of the holiday, New Year, winter recipes. There's some citrus, clementines and Meyer lemons. The reason the word blood shows up is because of blood oranges.
Dracula's not a fan of the site.
No, but also there's a lot of leafy greens, winter leafy greens like collard greens, and kale is in there somewhere, and lots of different names of soup. So split pea soup, minestrone, bean soups.
And I think you got what you were
Baked
looking
potato.
for, right? Because you have eggnog, candy,
Yeah.
gingerbread, right?
Yeah.
Things that are really fatty and make you want to go to sleep after you eat
Sugar.
them.
Yep.
And then you've got citrusy things, collard greens,
Right.
soups, things that you end up eating in order to try to lose weight. So you're not the only one who goes on a diet after the New Year. And all right, so
What was the tool for the workshop?
Oh, it's something I grabbed off GitHub. I used the same thing in a blog post for the data community blog about the DC Tech tweets, and I actually have code that I reuse snippets of from available on the DC data community blog. Sorry. So I give the details in an old blog post for the data community.
So where is this story here?
Where is what?
The story
What story?
in this.
Well, the story is just what's popular at Christmas, and then what becomes popular just a few weeks later. The trends go through a rapid change from the cookies and gingerbread and candy canes to split pea soup.
thanks, Valerie.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure what to do with it. I was literally just pulling this stuff together on the fly. So next is Mark. Plug this in. Got your thing.
Make sure this works. One problem solved. All right, so we, as we started thinking about how to visualize Christmas, the first thing we thought of was snow. And you see the snowflakes here. So we used our technology to start to analyze those. And what do they mean? And really what we were looking at was a variety of retail data that's available. And what are some of the things in the snowflakes, the two snowflakes are alike, that start to jump out at you, is that Christmas tree decorations, this was the best data we could get. 2008 and 2009 were pretty similar, but in 2010, they doubled. Not sure what that means or why it happened, but it was in the snowflake, right? And it was there. The next thing we looked at is, when do most people think Christmas starts? Any guesses? When does Christmas start for you? When's the holiday season start?
December 25th.
December 25th? Yeah. Mine's the 24th at about 3 in the afternoon when I'm hunting for presents. So the biggest group here, I've gone through the data, but this is 23%, 23% of people surveyed thinks the Christmas season starts on October 29th. Not something we expected to find. So that was one snowflake we analyzed. Second snowflake we started to look at told us we have a variety of different data. Percent of sales, what was this one here? You know, I can't read my own visualization. We'll go look at one of the other branches. This is going to be holiday sales overall, and you can see that from 2001, I think was when the Snowflakes started, to 2012, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Interestingly, though, the rate of growth year over year does start to change, right? And so as we were examining the Snowflake and trying to discover it, question there.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your idea there, but I'm just on the last one. How did you make the determination that people think that Christmas starts on October 29th?
The Snowflake told us. We actually got our hands on a variety of data, sales data, e-commerce data, surveys that have been done, and so this was, I don't actually remember the exact source, but one of our data scientists had a connection to San Diego State University, and they had a book of Christmas data, holiday retail data. So it was a survey that was done in 2011 for that one. Sales continued to grow here year over year, but the rate of growth for holiday sales is different. And when we first saw the Snowflake and we saw this little speck here, kind of expected that to be 2008, right? Everybody remember September, October 2008, not a fun time? Well, actually, this is 2008. It was a 4% change, and then 2009 was actually the smaller growth year at 0.5%. And I started thinking back to kind of my own situation, the business I had at the time, and 2009 wasn't all that bad. It was when you got to the end of 2009 and people realized, hey, this recession thing's real, it's going to last for a while, and it did. And you saw that December 2009, Christmas spend was slow, but it did pick up in 2010. Just some of the other data here was relative to what what industries the sales and revenue were coming from. So as we think about Christmas at Snowflakes, get this right, we just wanted to say thanks for having us here. And just so everybody knows, the snowflakes falling here are the same snowflakes that we looked at in detail. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So let's see. Did anybody see who was next? I think I'm going to have to talk about the next one. And so we had Singlifics, and that was in case I wasn't sure what was going to happen there. Then there's Morningside Analytics went through the, everybody familiar with the NORAD Santa Twitter handle? Right, so there's this whole page dedicated to NORAD apparently tracking Santa going around the world. It's pretty cool. So I asked them if they would make a map of that Twitter handle, and what they do is they see who's connected and what type of hashtags are being used and what it is that they're tweeting about, and they automatically create associations between them, cluster them together, and then name those clusters. This is all automatic. And so whatever you get, you sort of get. It's not tailored at all. So this is the visualization if there's nothing there. So if I go and I show all the nodes, you can see that. Can everybody see that okay? Do I need to make it a little bit bigger? It's okay? All right. And so you've got the different colors here, and this is a force graph. So all these different colors are a cluster, and the size is how many, how much content they're actually tweeting about. And their position is, if you're closer to the center, that means you're more connected. If you're closer to the edge, it means you're less connected in general. And what we can do here is we can hide all of them, and we can try to look at, okay, so Christmas marketing. All right, so who's connected to Christmas marketing? And we can see is teaching and education. All right, that's connected to Christmas marketing. Is NASA connected to it? Well, NASA's kind of over there on the side, so maybe not so much. If we click on liberal journalism, well, that's got this really interesting one in the middle, and that's BarackObama.com. I'm not quite sure why he's in the center of NORAD Santa, but I guess that they send enough content out following enough people that they actually end up kind of messing up our visualizations. And so if any, for anybody looking to actually communicate, if you end up being one of those people, from our point of view, we would actually cut you out because you just end up being noise. So if you're not useful in a specific way, then you're not useful in the general way either. I don't pay attention to that. So we get rid of the liberal journalism for a second, right? So now that's all gone. Maybe there's, I don't know, auto racing, cool actors. Let's see if there's any celebrities that connect it. So now it looks like the celebrities are all over the map, which kind of makes sense. So you've got marketing here, you've got celebrities connecting everything together, and that blue was NASA, right? So let's see if, and somehow, for whatever reason, UK and Ireland ended up being a big group, and British moms were in there. So British moms is going to be the light blue, and there it is. There's the marketing, and British moms directly connect, or very closely connect, Christmas marketing with NASA, right? That was NASA over there, right? Yeah. So why do British moms connect Christmas marketing with NASA? We'd have to go actually start diving down into the data deeper, but I think that's pretty cool to understand the relationships between things. So, anybody have any questions? Okay.
How many data sets do you analyze to create all these different categories?
Well, so we start off with the NORAD Santa Twitter handle, and then they go, I believe, 2 connections beyond that handle to see 2 connections beyond that handle. So if you follow somebody on Twitter, you're 1 connection away. If you know somebody, if you're following somebody and that somebody's following somebody else, that's 2 connections away. And so they go 2 connections away, and then they analyze all of the hashtags, all of the tweets, right? Anybody else? So I thought that was cool, the way that you can connect marketing. It's also interesting how marketing is so tightly bound to each other, but the fact that they're over on the edge like this means that they're not that connected to everybody else. So marketing is off in their own corner, thinking of ways to communicate with the rest of us without being connected to us. Anyway, okay, moving on. And this is the funniest thing that we had going on tonight, right? I'm going to put this back in the presentation mode. John, do you want to talk at all about the data set we found?
Sure, yeah. Thanks. So I was trying to come up with something to show for visualizing Christmas, and I was over at my girlfriend's place and trying to figure out how to have time for all this. And she said, well, why don't you look at the number of babies that are born 9 months after Christmas? And so, sure enough, I Googled around and found a data set that gave not the exact number, but the ranking for certain years. Actually came from the New York Times. And did a little preliminary analysis and found that, in fact, most of the most common days for people to be born are almost exactly 260 whatever days after Christmas.
That's what that spike is, and that line is right there, is a spike. So you get this, it's kind of random, and then it starts trending down. Where do you know how many days out Thanksgiving is? That's going to be...
Thanksgiving would be a little too early, but Christmas to New Year's is right around the...
A month is 30 days, so Thanksgiving is going to be right in here somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Thanksgiving is popular, but I can imagine that the reason it's not as popular as Christmas is that a lot of people end up sleeping at their in-laws, and that's all for you, right? A lot of people end up sleeping at their in-laws. A lot of people they're traveling most of the time, so they don't have a chance to improve and change these statistics. So we had, but what's funny about this, and really this whole thing was an experiment, was throw out an idea and see who would jump onto it. And everybody jumped onto this data set, none of any of the other ones. And so my mother's calling. She doesn't know when to get a hint.
She heard about babies.
So there's actually a couple of different versions of this. This one was created by Ben using Plotline, right? So it reminds me of D3 a little bit, but he put a holiday cheer on it. And as I go along here, you can see the rank that it actually has there, the 99, and then how many months into the whole process it is, right? So as expected, there's 8.7, 8.8, 9 months, right? And this is after Christmas. So what's interesting is that, you know, around here is New Year's, right? Around here is New Year's. It's not as popular as you might think. It's really at Christmas and leading up to Christmas. So I guess everybody goes and travels and goes there. So if anybody wants to know about Plotline, of course, Ben's not here. But
Now, does anyone have a theory about the early December dip? I suspect that's an artifact.
What's the theory on this dip? Anybody venture a guess?
People are buying.
It's cold.
And it's cold. It is cold.
But
that's
that can
all
lead to more
reason to stay
consumptions.
warm.
Holiday anxiety.
All of the. Oh, we got a question. We got an idea in the back.
I was just wondering, is this the United States or is this the world?
CUS. I was actually wondering if it's an artifact, if you only have a few years in here, that it might have to do with days of the week. But I just don't know what else it would be.
Yep. So and then so Will from Develop4 ended up doing this in a different. This is the same data, just visualized a little bit different. This is using D3, and you can go around the wheel here. The color is the ranking that it has, and you can go like this in order to get rid of some of them. So, you know, again, if you wanted to see where the highest ranking ones were, you know, the top half, that's the distribution for the top half, right? So you get a very different point of view. You can still go all the way down here and find out that, like, oh yeah, look, it's all concentrated in one particular area. It's not spread out, right? The highest ranking ones. But you can also start to see how these distributions change throughout the year, like which one might be the most uniform and which one isn't. So just different ideas on the same thing. I thought that was fun. And any...
But what is more intuitive to get?
I think it depends on what you're trying to say, right? So with this one, it's very clear. You can't help but focus on this spike and on this dip and maybe a little bit in here. The rest of it is just kind of boring. There's no real structure or form to it. If you want to convey, on the other hand, the distribution throughout the year of any particular set of rankings, you know, so this would be very low rankings, and it turns out that low rankings are, let's see, that's June, May, April, March. So they're more or less spread out from June to November.
So if you would do an animation of both versus time, which one would be better for your purposes?
I have no idea. I'd have to make that.
So that earlier graph was showing, presuming the conception dates, right? One before this?
This one?
Yeah.
Yes, well, it's presumed conception dates, right, because most women have a baby in 9 months.
Well, so one thing that might suggest a reason for a dip before Christmas was the guy who runs Information is Beautiful, David McCandless, did an analysis of breakup times based on people updating their statuses on Facebook, and he observed a big spike in breakups, like at the beginning of December, with a dip, of course, on Christmas, because that would just be too cruel. So maybe there's a little dip at the beginning of December because, you know, people are...
Maybe we'll have to make that part of... I was thinking about doing this again as for like visualizing leaders. As we get better at this, we'll make these things faster and a little bit more streamlined, but maybe we'll do it for them too.
Sean, even though 9 months is what people say for Christmas, like for gestation period, it's more like 40 weeks, and so that's closer to 9.25. So
Okay.
where's 9.25 on there?
9.2.
Day after Christmas, that would be the most likely day. So that before it is probably before Christmas.
So it's leading up to Christmas. Maybe there's too much tryptophan on Christmas. If you're doing anything like that.
Corporate Christmas party.
The corporate Christmas party, I like it. There you go. All right, that's enough of that. I got to let Robert get up here and talk. I'm taking up too much time. So without further ado, we have visual storytelling with Robert Kosara. We'll have to switch computers again. And I just want to give one more round of applause for everybody. That really took a lot of work.
This just worked 15 minutes ago, so we'll see if it's still working. And close. Yeah. All right. Cool. All right. So thank you all for being here, and thanks John and Sean for inviting me. I'll try and stand over here a bit so I can gesture a bit more and not hit there. So my name is Robert Kosara. I'm a research scientist at Hubble Software. I'm not actually touring the country with this talk, so this was handcrafted just for tonight. After talking to Sean at lunch, I kind of made this 2 talks. So I'm going to try and be fast, and I'm not actually sure how much time I have, but I'm going to try and do this in about 45 minutes or so, which is utterly impossible. But I want to do 2 things here. I want to show you a little bit of research, and then I want to talk, and this is going to be more general perceptual research for visualization, and then I want to talk about data, storytelling and data and some of that work that I've been working on. So I'll walk you through, I think, 3 examples very quickly about research, because that's not something you might be aware of, how research works, where all this stuff comes from, about, well, a number of things in visualization, because some of the things that people tell you about visualization is actually based more on people's opinions or people's ideas about design and so on. So I want to show you a few things that are actually based on actual research. There's obviously more, but this is a start. So here's a study that I particularly like and that I mentioned to Sean earlier, and he liked it. So this is a study on color, and this came out of, people always say like, color, or don't really think that color is not important, and I have a few things to say about the things that we just saw here in terms of colors and color choices. I'm not going to do that right now, it's going to take too long. But I'm going to point you to a paper in a few minutes that might help you along with this. And I'm also going to, if I remember, mention a research that's very useful. So this is a very interesting piece of research that was done, I think, 5 or 6, 7 years ago now, in Princeton, I believe. I forget, actually, I should look this up again. The idea is that there's a known effect where differentiating colors, or telling colors apart, is easier when 2 colors have different names. So if you look at orange versus blue, for example, you're faster than if you're looking at 2 shades of orange. And the thing that they tried here was that in Russian, there are 2 different words for different shades of blue. They don't actually have a term for what we would consider blue in English or in most other languages. And so what they found is they did a study on Russian speakers and English speakers, the idea being that, I can point here. Yeah, okay. So what they actually saw was basically this lower part of this. They saw the reference rectangle, and then they saw 2 other rectangles. And the question was, which one is the same color as the reference rectangle? And you had to just hit one of the mouse buttons with 2 different keys to indicate that as fast as possible. And you're faster when there are different colors that have different names, orange and blue, green and yellow. And you're slower when they're the same shade. But the sameness is actually different depending on which language you speak. And the smart thing about this study was, and so there is an influence, I don't want to go into much detail here because I don't have time for that, but there's an influence here that if you're into psychology, it's really surprising, of the language center on our visual perception, because that's not actually something that people would think actually exists. And the other thing is that in this experiment, that they then said, well, this is actually true, it's really the effect. And so they had the same people, or I guess maybe the same people, do the same experiment, but they had to recite a nonsense poem at the same time. So the language centers were busy, and could not interfere with the color selection anymore, with the color differentiation, and then the effect went away. So now the DVDC had the same effect across all the different colors. They were actually able to show that color perception is actually influenced by the names that we have for those things, which is very interesting. And there's a lot more about color. So there's a book here that I really highly recommend. It's called Through the Language Class. This is by Guy Deutscher. Fantastic book about how our thinking about languages has evolved from the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, which kind of went out of style, now it's coming back, and lots of other things. It's a really, really interesting book. It's really well written, really interesting to read. Another one that Naomi here is going to find interesting, I guess, there's this paper here, the rainbow color map, still considered harmful. One of the things that you might want to look into as, this is an actual research paper that came, or a visualization viewpoints paper that came out 5, 6, 7 years ago, more than perhaps than that. And that was based on an earlier paper that was called The Rainbow Color Map Considered Harmful. And so there's actually a history to people using bad color maps in visualization. And I'm going to show you one more thing. A resource, just to show you this quickly, is called ColorBrewer. .org, and it takes you to this website that doesn't really fit the screen here, but the idea is that it gives you some really good color maps to choose from, and it also shows you some interesting facts about how different colors work together and stuff like that. So there's some interesting research out there on that. And I could talk for hours about color, so let me get started with that. All right, so this is a bit about color. Now, another thing that's really interesting about visualization is that there's a lot of visual metaphors in it. And those metaphors are a lot less obvious than you might think. So here's work by Barbara Tversky and colleagues at Stanford from 2001 or so, 2000 perhaps. She had these bar charts here that she showed to people and asked them to explain. So this first one is about the average height of kids, 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds, and this one is, these are just schematic bar charts, so don't worry about the numbers. And this is for the average height of women and men. And she showed this to people and said, well, explain. What does it show you? And people said things like, well, 10-year-olds aren't as tall as 12-year-olds, and men are taller than women, right? Not very surprising. But then she replaced the bar chart with line charts, and then did the same thing again. And now she got a response like, well, as kids get older, they grow, right, for the left one. And for the right one, people started saying things like, well, it looks like the more male you become, the taller you become. Which obviously makes no sense, but it's very interesting because what happens here is that there's an implication from the metaphor, there's continuity in the lines. The way Tversky likes to talk about this, bars separate, or the gap between the bars separates, the lines connect. And so those give you the sense that there is connectivity and continuity. So we set out to do a study a while ago, this is about 5 years ago, to kind of look at how different types of displays, or different decorations essentially, change the way people think about data. And so we had this number of 5 different ways of decorating this chart. We did this for 4 different types of charts. You're going to see a couple of those. So we had a filled area around the whole thing. We had an outlined area around the whole thing. We had parts borders, that borders around each individual part, and we had the whole thing exploded, and we had an undecorated one. And here basically all the different combinations. So we had 16 different combinations of all those different decorations that you could create from those. And then we applied those to a number of different chart types. So one of them was, you might call this a tree map or a kind of a square pie chart. But the idea was we told people you're looking at the size or the number of people, whatever, of a company. And we asked them to rate each of those charts. I'm going to see a few, well, you're going to see one more, on a number of different scales, including things like, is this a rigid company? Is this a flexible company? Is this a company that can easily change? Is this a good place to work? And we had like 10 different ones. There's some kind of set of those questions. And people, when they looked at this, said, well, this looks very rigid. This looks like it's not going to change at all. This is set in its ways, and it's not going to change. And I have some hypotheses about that. And then we look at this, or we show people this, and they said other things. Like, oh, and one thing we also asked about is stability. How stable is this? So this was very rigid and very stable. Whereas this one was not nearly as rigid, but it certainly was a lot less stable. In fact, it was basically ranked along as one of the lowest in stability. And we had this little thing that I should actually say this was my student Caroline Sinkeri's work. She had this study set up so that it would actually look at the rankings. People would have to go through like 50 or 60 of those things, and would pick out the ones that had the most difference between them along those axes, and would show them at the end to people and say, well, these two you ranked the most different along the rigidity axis or the stability axis. Why is that? And people would have to explain that. And we had some really interesting responses, a bit like the first we worked earlier. For this one, people said, this looks like it's really unstable, like it would just roll away, essentially. And this got me thinking, it's really interesting, because rolling, of course, that's kind of an affordance of the circular shape of this donut chart. But there's something else that you need for this to roll, actually two more things. One of them is gravity, there has to be a force that applies here, and there has to be an imbalance, because otherwise there's no reason for this to roll, right? And this had me stumped for a while, until I showed this to an artist friend of mine, who said, well, it's obvious. Anybody guess here why this would be obvious that this is going to roll? Yeah?
Red is so heavy.
Yes, exactly. So the dark colors are much heavier. To an artist, that's just obvious. But if you think about it, it's not at all obvious that in this entirely abstract shape that has nothing to do with a real thing, a real physical object, there would be any perception of weight or any kind of physical kind of force. Yeah.
If you have a traditional pie chart, I think the motion sensation will not be as strong. This looks like a wheel.
Right. So it also looks a bit like wheels, right? If it were a pie chart, I would have to look at it later if you had the same effect for the pie chart as well. It was certainly strong for this one, that's true. So this was really interesting, and that led us down a road. Yeah, of course. So, and it turned out that gravity is actually something that's really, really fundamental, not just in physical world, but actually also in things like abstract art. This is a painting by Joseph Albers. It's called Homage to the Square, and there's an art theorist whose name I'm going to remember in a second. Rudolf von Arnheim. He argues that this is the only way this makes sense as a painting. So this is an entirely abstract composition of these squares. But if they were all centered, it would look weird and kind of it would make you uneasy, because it would feel like there's something that's kind of making it float. Whereas in this way, it's a bit like cello squares or cubes that have set. And now it feels like it's resting and it's complete. And I'm actually going to spend some time tomorrow, perhaps, in the National Gallery to look at some Mark Rothko paintings and see if that's actually the same effect there as well. It's very interesting to see how you can find these effects in entirely abstract compositions and entirely abstract art that has nothing to do with physical reality. Also, another one that I find even more fascinating is typography. For typography to work, you actually have to have things that kind of sit on the baseline. And so it's a bit hard to see here, but the bottom half of this is actually heavier and wider than the top half. And so that makes it sit more better on the front and on the baseline, because it's got the center of gravity is further down. Yeah.
Does anybody see that the 3 is going to roll like the wheel? Or maybe 0 will roll? We usually don't see that for some reason.
Right, because they usually are constructed so that they're not round.
No,
or that they're not unbalanced.
0 has a round bottom.
Right, sure.
Okay.
Right. Yep.
I think the other value is it looks like it could flip, like on an airport, with flights changing on a clock because of the lines.
Oh, you mean like a flip clock? No, I'm not sure I'm following.
In other words, and that's not our.
I actually had a question about the previous. You talked about gravity, but there's also a sense of depth, simply based on color. That your eye is drawn in to the darker color. Mm-hmm. So that sense of depth is created simply by shades of color. But my point about the 3 was that with the lines that's what it reminded me of is that there's an upper and a lower quadrant, and that the upper quadrant could flip. So this is an implied sense of potential movement.
When you talk about depth, you mean that the darker colors look more remote, because
Correct.
in typical life,
There's a sense
the
of
lighted
3D.
ones are close to you.
Yes, the darker one is farther away.
Sure,
And the lighter color
but you can
is
still do the whole thing centered, so that the depth and the fact where it's centered or not is actually, they're independent from each other. You're right, of course, about the depth part of this, but it could still be, it could be a tunnel that you're looking through and from a center point of view, or from further down, and this is what you're doing here.
Exactly.
So, okay. We're going to talk about that other point later. I didn't quite catch that. I just want to move on. There's actually some work that was done in the 1970s on how gravity affects the way we remember things. What they did was they showed this planter next to a window, either sitting on some kind of pedestal or not, and then they left the window there, took the planter away, and then they asked people to point to where that had been. And it turned out that when there was no support there, that people would consistently point lower, further down than when there was a pedestal there. And what happens is that people apparently kind of start predicting that the object is falling, and so what they remember is kind of where it will be in the future. That's actually a really interesting effect that's been studied a bit more recently as well. And so we did a study on this where we looked at a couple of scatter plots, and we pointed out objects. We didn't actually use arrows, we had them flicker, and then asked people to look at them and then took them away. Then we asked people to point to them. And we found that there is a gravity effect. This is a very strange slide here, but basically what this shows you is that the objects, so explain first, the other objects are called distractors. And so this is the target, and these are the distractors. And what happens is that when the distractors are above the object, the target actually gets pulled out towards the other objects. And when the distractors are below, it gets pulled down a lot more than that. So there's both kind of a gravity effect in the kind of Star Trek sense, where you have planets floating around and things are attracted to each other, and there is a gravity effect that's kind of just moving, pointing downwards as well. And we then added another dimension, or another step to this, which is we had 3 points, or 3 objects, where the center one was exactly in the middle between the other two, and we had certain decorations between 2 of them. And then we asked people which one is the middle one closer to. And so because they were always exactly in the middle, by pure chance you would just pick one, 50% you would pick left, 50% right. But it turns out, and so we had a couple of those different ones, so we had connecting lines, we had outlines, fill and so on, similarity in terms of color and size and so on. And then we went to, this is a bit hard to see all here, this here because of the projector being a bit washed out. But we then looked at this and found that actually the second strongest way of connecting objects is drawing a line between them. And the strongest one is actually drawing this kind of lasso around them. So we were kind of trying to figure out ways to use that. Kind of, then you can look at the other, some of these differences are significant, some of them aren't. But you can find different ways to indicate different kinds of relationships and similarity using different visual visual properties, I should say. And actually use some of this guidance to actually help with that. This was a very kind of quick run through a number of different research topics. One book, I figured I'd give you a few pointers to books. So here's another one that I really, really like. This is Mark Chingizi's The Vision Revolution. He doesn't technically talk about visualization. In fact, he doesn't actually talk about visualization at all. But he talks about perception. And he talks about some of the things that I mentioned, like this idea of predicting the future. Like, for example, when you're catching a ball, that actually physically you're not able to do it. Your muscles, your nerves aren't fast enough to actually do that. You're doing something that's physically impossible for you. The reason you can do it is because you predict where the ball is going, and you can just go where it's going to be, and you're tuned to just doing that. And there's lots of other interesting stuff in there. He calls these the 4 superpowers that we have, and so he kind of walks you through those in these chapters. It's really good book. All right. So at this point, I'm going to switch to a different talk. This is in a very abridged version of. How much time do I have left? I'll just keep talking. We'll see. 10 minutes. Okay.
Sorry. What's that?
How much time do I have left? Okay. All right. Well, I'll try this in 20 minutes or so. So storytelling, right? This is a new thing that people talk about, and you may have heard this in lots of different contexts. And people have been talking more about data storytelling in recent years. And I've been doing some work on trying to figure out what does it actually mean. How do stories work when it's about data? How do we use ideas from visualization and from journalism to kind of bring those together and tell better stories about data? I was going to just kind of establish my street cred here. So I had a paper earlier this year in IEEE Computer with Chuck McKinley, storytelling as being what I call the next step for visualization. And this is going to be another special issue of another IEEE journal, which I'm a magazine rather than I'm forgetting what it's called. But no, this is in computer. But in Computing Now, it's actually one. No, not CGA. In Computing Now, it's going to be, and there's going to be a video of me talking as well. So it's going to come out in January. But more interestingly, there is a conference that we are organizing, we being Tableau Software, that's called Tapestry. That's all about data storytelling. So if you're interested in that, this is going to be at the end of February, close to here in Annapolis, Maryland. And if you're interested in that, check out the website, follow the Twitter handle, and apply for an invitation. This is invitation only. We have to limit it to about 100 people. And but now is a good time to apply because we're not full yet, but we're getting close. So if you're interested in that, that is something we're especially looking for journalists, we're looking for government folks, and basically anybody who's interested in data storytelling. There we have some really interesting speakers. We have Alberto Cairo speaking, Aaron Pilhofer from the New York Times, and I'm blanking on a third speaker also. It'll come back to me in a second.
John speaking.
Oh yeah, and we have the short stories. So we have 3 keynotes, and we have some short stories. John Schwab is speaking, Chuck McKinley, Santiago Ortiz, and a few other people. And I'm going to think of the third keynote speaker in a second. Come back in a second. But you can go to the website and find out. So, of course, Shake Porway of DataKind. Yeah, and so here's a picture from last year. It was in this awesome hotel in Nashville. It's called the Union Station Hotel, former train station. And so anyway, but this is the conference. So Tapestry conference. So stories are interesting because they take us beyond the simple data visualizations or data graphs. But this is what we're used to, and this is what we're kind of supposed to be doing, right? Everybody, there are some people who say that everything should be a bar chart. Bar chart is basically never wrong. It always tells you the numbers, it tells you the numbers correctly, you can always read it correctly, you can compare things and so on. There are lots of good reasons why bar charts are good. But they're also all the same, so it's kind of a problem that if you want things to stand out and to be memorable, it becomes kind of hard to use them. Of course, you can add something. You can add text here. This turns out to be about total House and Senate campaign expenditures in millions of dollars from the late 70s to the early 80s. You can even make this point stronger and say, well, these are monstrous costs. It's still kind of not very impressive, right? I mean, this is just kind of, yeah, so what? But then you can also just make this a bit more lively, right? And show that same data in a way that's a bit more impressive and a bit more memorable. Right? And so this monster here is essentially a bar chart. Of course, it's got lots of problems if you're really, if you're really looking for those kind of things. So it's got a curved baseline. It's not a level baseline. It's got bars that aren't bars, but they're triangles. The reference lines are curved. There's a freaking monster there, right? This is all chart. So who needs that? And you've got very clever things here, like obviously sign flourishes. You've got the vote button there. You've got the tail that makes a dollar sign. Even the reflections, they're hard to see here, but on the reflections on the saliva, those are dollar signs as well. So it's a really clever little thing. This was done by Nigel Holmes in 1980, I believe. And it's one of the classics in a way of data infographics in kind of the good way. So there are good infographics and bad infographics. I'm not going to go into that distinction much further, but there is a lot of really interesting work that was done on how to get across not just the data, but also the point of the data. And this is an interesting way of doing that. I'm not saying that this is the way everything should be done, but of course there are lots of reasons why you can't do this for all your data, but this is a way to make your data into more of a story than just turning it into another bar chart. There's another thing that was called the isotype. Otto Neurath developed this in the 1920s, which is a way to show data, and he published a whole bunch of books that compared different countries and all kinds of different things based on numbers. So basically it would tell you a story or tell you about the world in numbers, based on charts like this. So this is about the Industrial Revolution and how home weaving turned into industrial weaving and factory work over the course of the 19th century. All these black figures there are 10, each of those represents 10,000 workers who work at home. Each of the red ones are 10,000 workers who work in factory, and you can see the factories with the smokestacks kind of swallowing out the workers over time. And the blue things are the amount of product. You can see, of course, that is increasing quite a bit. That is a way of showing you more context, because this works as bar charts. You can basically read this like a bar chart, and it's actually very precise, but you still get the idea of what this is about. You certainly can understand that this is about people. It's obvious from just looking at it, and then of course you can dig deeper and actually understand what actually it is about by reading the captions. Of course, people always are a bit weary of stories because they can lead you astray. And I guess here it's probably safe to make fun of the New York Times, but for example, some of you might remember the story from earlier this year, actually February or so, the Tesla story about this guy who test drove a Tesla along the Tesla Model S along the East Coast, and supposedly it broke down and stuff like that. And there was some interesting back and forth between the two, and between Elon Musk and between that journalist, and both were basically talking about data. They were looking at it differently, and so there's some interesting problems that can happen when you're kind of trying to tell an interesting story, but maybe the car isn't actually doing what you're trying to make it do, to make it more interesting or whatever. So this can be dangerous, but it can also be incredibly useful. And so for the rest of this, I want to talk about a few techniques or a few steps that we can take to turn the data into essentially what's more a story. And I'm going to see how far we get with the time that I have. But the most important one is the beginning. So my first one here is sequence. Most stories, or most data visualizations by themselves don't have that. But sequence is incredibly important to turn, or actually I would say this is actually the crucial thing. Without sequence, there is no story. And sequence can mean time, but it doesn't have to be. And I think I have an example where I may have taken this out, where sequence isn't actually time. This is a very hard to see piece, but even so, you can tell that there are 3 steps here. You can read this left to right. It's not very hard to understand what this is, even if you don't understand what the individual things are that it's telling you. There's some text to this, but it's not actually that important. The important thing here is that it's a sequence. That was done by Jonathan Corbin for the New York Times a few years ago. There's also this chart, that even with that level of being washed out, how many of you have seen this before? We've seen this before. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm preaching to the choir here. But the idea is that this chart, Minar's chart that's usually called Napoleon's March to Moscow, is a story because it's easy to read left to right as a sequence. So he luckily went west to east. So this is in Lithuania somewhere here, and this is Moscow. And so this first part here that also works a bit like an arrow because the ribbon gets narrower as it goes east, makes this look like a sequence, and we know that the time passes this way. Or well, it usually passes this way, and then he's going back, so then it goes the other way. But it's actually fairly easy to read this as a story. That's why it's so compelling as a story, even without all the annotations that aren't actually all that important. If you just want to look at X data, you would get in the way, I would argue, if you want to look at this as a story. There's also there are ways to turn more numerically oriented things into stories. One thing I like in particular is called the connected scatter plot. And it's a bit hard to see this, actually it's almost impossible to see here. But lines here connect points, each of which is a year. And the chart, there are 2 axes here. One is the number of car fatalities per 100,000 per year. The other one is the number of miles driven per 100,000 people or so. It's all kind of normalized to population. And so each year is a point. And when you start connecting those points, you get this very interesting shape. And you can start following that, and you can look at the points where direction changes. And you're starting kind of to ask questions about this. What happened there? And then, of course, you have these annotations that tell you something about that. And then there's, this whole thing makes a very nice layout for a story. And but the way this works is that there are data points here, and there are about 50 or 60 of those, and they're really hard to speak about. Sorry about that. Maybe I can go back to this one at least. But there are also interesting things that happen. For example, there's this loop there during the oil crisis, and there are other things like that. I'm actually doing a study right now on trying to figure out how this actually works. This is a very complex way of representing data, and the more you go into it, the harder it actually is to understand. But the point of this is it tries to kind of show you that sequence and to walk you through a story. And that's what it's actually pretty good at. And then, of course, the most obvious is just using sequence, using an animation. This is the Gapminder tool. Have you seen this before? Gapminder, Hans Rosling's talk. Okay. So this should play, I think, here. What this does is it basically walks you through a number of years. Each bubble here is a continent. I'm not going to even explain what this is about. But the point is, you can there's no question what this is. You can see these things moving. That's the basis for cinema and everything. So you can understand what's going on here, and you have to watch this. There are some studies that look at movement and how usually they say it's bad, and it's true, but because it's really hard for you to remember movement, especially when you have more than 3 or 4 things moving, and if there's a lot of movement, if it's complex movement. In this case, they mostly all move in the same direction, so it's very easy to remember the trend, and if there's an outlier, it's very easy to remember that one. But it tends to make this much, much harder if there's lots of movement going on. So it's not a good analysis technique, but it works very well for presentation. And so presentation, a sequence, is something since, so I used to be an academic, now that I work for a company, I also have to throw in a little bit about what we're doing at Tableau as well. So we're working on a new feature there. This is called Story Points. This is coming out in early next year in Tableau 8.2. And the idea is that we have this new thing here at the top, which is called the Navigator, and you will be able to basically create individual, or you capture individual points and you can walk through them. So what you see here is the dashboard, and you can see some stuff at the top there, which are these points. And then you can walk through that and see different things, like in this case, I'm not going to explain this data here because there's no time for this, but this is a map, and then you can see different things, like this is another map, this is in San Francisco here, and then New York. And whenever you make a change to the data, it basically says, and this is at the top right there, there's this capture button. It says, well, there is something that you've changed, do you want to capture this as a new story point? And then you can either do this or not, and then it basically makes this a new point in your story, and that way you can walk people through. So this is, again, a sequence through which you can tell a story. And we're trying to make this kind of, have 2 versions of this. One is easy, or kind of light touch, where you just basically collect a couple of insights and use those to kind of give those to somebody and say, here's stuff I've found. Or you actually try to make this into a narrative, which is much harder because you actually need to turn the individual points into an upgraded arc, which is actually a lot more work, much harder to do. Any questions so far?
So what is a story, according to, how do you relate to the word story? What is a story? Is it just a list of facts that you present in some way?
So that's a good question. I don't have a complete answer yet. I'm actually working on that. But there's a lot of work that's looking at why we tell stories, how stories relate to memory. So I can give you reasons why stories are a good idea. They aid memory. If you want to present and you want people to take something away from a presentation, you want to tell people a story because you tie your facts together in a much more cohesive way. You also want to be able to basically give people a sense that the entire presentation isn't just individual items, individual facts that are independent, but that they actually have a causal relationship between them. So the other thing about stories, other than sequence, the other crucial thing, and that's actually really hard to do in many cases, especially when it's about data, is causality. Because in an actual real story, one event causes another event. If there is no causality, it's just random things that happen. And so that's actually really hard for most technical people to understand. But that turns out to be really important for storytelling in the classical sense. And that is something that I'm trying to figure out how this works in real estate, which I don't know yet. But there are a number of pieces, kind of strands that I'm trying to kind of tie together, but I'm not done with that yet. What I have right now mostly is techniques that I think work well. But I don't have the actual definition of what a story is or how it works in visualization. But that's not something we should actually talk about because I need to talk to you about your work from 10, 12 years ago. All All right, so another point, and I'm just going to go through this very quickly now. I've got 3 more. Another one is called depth. The idea being that you can add a lot of information to something by adding smart things to them. This is my favorite scatter plot. It was done by Hannah Fairfield, who used to be at the Washington Post, she's now at the New York Times. And this was actually done, I think, no, this is not in the New York Times. What this is it shows you income, men versus women. So we have the men along the x-axis here, women along the y-axis. And this is a scatter plot. And I actually took the one out that doesn't have the additional things, so it's kind of hard to appreciate perhaps. But a regular scatter plot is really hard to read because you have to basically look for the main diagonal. And we're very bad at that. So what you did here, which is extremely smart, is draw this line here, which is the main diagonal, which means that all the points that are on that diagonal is equal income for men and women. And all the points that are to the top left is women making more money, and all the points to the bottom right are men making more money. And the second part, which is perhaps even better because I had never thought about that before, is to draw these additional lines, and what those say here is actually, the first one is 10% less, this one is 10% less, 20% less, and 30% less for women. And you can now actually read this to less than 10% precision, which is actually really amazing for a scatter plot because you usually can't do that. And you can actually, and of course this is interactive in the web, you can mouse over and tell you the actual numbers, but there's a lot of information you can get from this just by looking at it, by adding this information. And then this walks you through a bit of an argument here by, or well, at least a sequence, by letting you walk through a number of different groups of professions that they picked out. I forget what the order is here, but basically the idea is that they annotate a couple of those to point out some of the outliers in particular, to kind of make the case for why is there such a discrepancy in those areas.
So where's the story here? Before you started to use the word storytelling, your content graph. Now, I'm trying to find the connection with stories here.
Right, so this is where it walks you through. So
Repeat the question. Could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, so the question is what's the, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question was that, I could see those graphs 10, 15 years ago without talking about storytelling. Where the storytelling aspect comes into this, how is it different from graphs you could have done maybe 15 years ago?
So I don't think that this is necessarily a strong story in itself, but the idea is a good one. What I was actually trying to do in this talk earlier, before I kind of took it apart for this, is that I was trying to say, well, here are different ideas, and in the end, we're going to throw them all together, and that's going to make a really good story. But I don't think this exists yet. I haven't seen a good visual story yet. I don't think that has been done. But there are some ideas that I think are really good, and this is one of them. So being able to add more information to it, and adding more annotations to it that tell you what, how to read it, and then walk you through points, like in this case. So this is not a story as such, but it's walking through essentially an argument. And that's actually very common in news graphics, but it's not really an end-to-end story yet. So there are a couple of those, and then, another example here is, again, to talk about depth. How do you break data? How do you show certain data manipulation? So in this case, this is about how to break up these continents into countries. And so these bubbles here, each bubble here is a continent, and I think they're going to actually be labeled, so I'm going to try to, yeah, there you go. And so what he's doing here is really interesting because he breaks up these continents into their countries, and the cool thing about that is it shows you something about the overlap between those continents. Because as a bubble, they're basically centered around their median, or the mean, and the bubble size is the number of people. But it doesn't actually tell you much about the huge range of, in this case, this is income versus life expectancy, or child survival, but that's kind of similar. And you can see that all of those, within each continent, there are huge, or between those continents, there are huge overlaps between them. And this is basically a drill down operation. You're going from one level of aggregation, which is the continent, which is very high, to a lower level, which is the countries. And then actually in a separate step later, he actually goes into some of those countries and breaks them up into quintiles. And then you can see again that some of those countries, like for Africa, he has like Yemen and South Africa, even though they're on opposite ends of that chart, they're still overlapping for like 3/5 of that range, or maybe 2/5 of that range at least. There's a lot of overlap between those countries and those continents. With the exception perhaps of the OECD, which is kind of way out there. And then another one is, and that's more going back to stories, is about focus. Focus is really important when you try to tell a story, because if you're just throwing lots and lots of information at people, and that's what we do in visualization very often, you're not actually telling a story, and people don't take much away from it. And so I want to show you an example to kind of illustrate this. This is a map somebody drew of Napoleon's Russian campaign for Wikipedia. If you go to Russian campaign Napoleon on Wikipedia, you find this. And this is just the way there. So this is like the blue here are the French, the red are Russians. There are lots of names here of generals and stuff, and lots of battles and whatever. And then this is the way back, right? So again, the red are the Russians, the blue are the French, on the left, and so on. And there's lots of stuff going on here. And this is, once you've seen those two maps, you start to appreciate this. Because this is really focused on one thing, and one thing only, which is the number of people in Napoleon's army. Of course, this is reducing the fate of, I didn't point this out, but if you know the numbers, 422,000 men who go out into this war, 10,000 come back. So this is about 500,000 people only on the French side, not including about 3 times as many on the Russian side, plus civilians, another, I don't know, million or more people. And this is just a lot of people whose story is told in one number, essentially, here over time. So that kind of focus is really, really important to really get us a point across. Otherwise, you're just kind of getting lost in all this detail. Yep.
I really appreciate the conceptual map you're providing, and I just wanted to introduce 2 words, which I see. I really appreciate the conceptual map that you're providing, and I wanted to introduce 2 words that I think link the examples that you just gave. One is abstraction, the idea that in this case, a lot of those arrows have been abstracted into a few pieces. You're naming it focus, but I think that's an important concept. And the other is aggregation, which is what we were seeing in the Rosling, the aggregation of data and how much that can shift data as it gets aggregated or disaggregated, and how much it can also alter the story based on how the aggregation occurs.
Right. I don't think that this is abstraction. This is focus, because he hasn't abstracted away these things, he's just left them out. And that's a different way of looking at it. And the other thing about aggregation, I'm not disagreeing, but there are different ways of doing this. So aggregation is one way of adding more depth to it, but there are certainly other ways. Yeah. But yeah, those are also good points. All right, I think this is my last example, but we'll see. This is a chart. How many have seen this before here? Okay, this is really surprising. So I'm always surprised that in very different audiences, the number depends a lot, and I would have expected more people to have seen this. This was published by the Obama administration in 2010 or so, and it shows the number of jobs lost per month over about 2 years. And what it shows here is the Bush administration here in red, the Obama administration in blue. And the neat thing about this, and there's a lot I could talk about here, but I have like a minute left or so, is that the clever thing is that the bars are pointing down. That may not be all that exciting to you, but to me it's very interesting because it tells you how to read this. Anybody who sees this knows that bars pointing down are bad, or at least that's what you expect. Things shouldn't point down. So things are pointing down more and more on the Bush, and now on the Obama they're pointing down less. So something has gotten less bad, or maybe better, right? So if you look at it this way, that's not what you want, because stuff was getting more, we got more stuff, we got more things on the Bush, and now it's getting less, so that's obviously not what we want. So, and this is the usual way, of course, because the number of people who lose their jobs, the number of jobs lost, is a natural number, it's not actually a negative number. So this is really interesting to think about. And also I like this as an example of focusing and reducing the amount of information, because what they did here was very cleverly use color here to represent the administration, whereas you could have made this a lot less subtle, like adding some pictures here and maybe be more or less subtle about the choice of picture and try and kind of liven this up and make it more interesting and more obvious how to read, but that's not what they did. So I think this is really interesting because it's really easy to completely screw these things up. But really reducing them and stepping back and realizing what all the things that you could throw out and that you don't need is actually pretty hard. Okay, and then my last example, this is actually really my last example, and it's impossible to see here, but this is a line chart that was done by the New York Times a number of years ago. And what you're not seeing here, you might have seen this on the sides there, maybe not, is that there are actually lots and lots of gray lines in the back. And you will see some of them in a second, because I'm going to start mousing over here. And what you see is this is the unemployment rate for the whole country. This is again aggregation. And once the mouse starts moving, which we will in a second, or not. Yeah, there we go. So once the mouse starts moving here, it's going to mouse over those lines, and there we go. The lines are responding. And so now these are all different groups of people based on these filters at the top. And so when you click, it shows you the unemployment rate for those people, and it shows you who they are with those filters at the top. So there is, I call this information scent. This is an idea from human-computer interaction, where it tells you where there's more information, so you can start sniffing and following that trail and see that. Okay, without, way over time. So these are the 4 points that I was talking about here, that I think are really important parts of stories. And 2 more books here. The first one, if you want to learn more about how to tell stories, there is one really good book I really like, which is by Alberto Cairo, The Functional Art. It's not actually telling you about storytelling so much, but he's a journalism professor at the University of Miami, and he's also going to be talking about industry. And he's got some really, really good examples. He's worked as a journalist for many years, and he's got a lot of background in data visualization and so on. He's got some really interesting things to say. And then the one on the right there is a more general visualization book, but it's a really well done one that actually explains how visualizations work, which is really, really rare. Most visualization books are just, here are lots of pictures, figure it out. But Isabel Mireles, I'm mispronouncing her name there, but that's her name, Isabel Mireles, Design for Information. It's a really good book because it tells you more than most books do. I mostly hate visualization books, but this one is one that I really like, so highly recommend. And with that, thank you for your attention, and if there are any more questions, I'm happy.
Could you just talk a little bit more about information sense? I don't think I quite understood that. Elaborate a little bit more.
So the idea is that you want to. So there's this concept in visual analytics that's called information foraging. The idea is that you're looking for information and you're kind of following some kind of trail to find the things that you need to kind of do your thing with data. And the scent is what kind of leads you through some kind of analysis. In HCI, there were some papers on what's called scented widgets, where the widget, like you can imagine, you've seen, or maybe if you use Chrome, for example, or I think also some of the PDF readers in the search, it shows you, and also I think Word does this now, it shows you on the scroll bar where the hits are, where things were found. So it gives you a sense, not just in the window that you're seeing right now, but also further down where you will find the hits to your search. And that's a scented widget. So there is a scent there that you can follow that kind of tells you where to find more things. And that's also what I was trying to show you there, even though it's really hard to see here. But if you can give people an idea that there's more, you can kind of entice them to start interacting. And that's something that's important for, especially for exploratory. This is very exploratory. If you want to tell people, look, there's interaction here, you have to kind of give them an idea that there's something that you can click that you can do. And so that is really clever because it doesn't just jump up and down and say, click me, but it's there and very subtle, and you can just kind of mouse over and it responds. And now you're like, okay, what else can I do here? So that's the rough idea of information science. But again, the way I'm using this is a bit different than HCI is used.
So only for interactive graphics then?
Yes, it requires interaction. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, I have a few comments. One of them is, if you look on Hans Rosling's talks, okay, let's say the first one. So he has those graphs that you presented, some of them in that style from his website. But also what strikes me when I watch him, he has a storytelling style. He tells you an anecdote in the beginning that is a little bit funny, and he captures the audience by that in the beginning. He talks, immediately it opens their mind to the right, more to the right side of the brain than to the left side, so they don't criticize him that much. And then, if you see when he talks, he has passion in his voice, and he moves, and I think this part a big part of the success of his presentations. Although there is no interaction in the sense of human-computer interaction, but interaction in a sense of storytelling that you sometimes, by yourself, you achieve understanding or you close some gaps that he doesn't say exactly what they are, so you feel you are part of it because you use your own mind to actually understand what is happening. So that's an example to me of storytelling, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the way you put the data, but also how you present it, okay? So maybe that's another layer of storytelling on top of the examples that you gave.
Sure.
And in light of that, I don't know if you want to do it. Would you tell us a story?
Yeah, I don't have one ready here right now, but we are actually working on building a bit of a library of stories. Yeah. No, you're right. Of course, there are a lot of Hans Rosling kind of appeal is that he just gets really into it, and he also knows his data. He knows how to tell a story about it. And I think that also opened the academic community up to accepting this kind of work more than it did before. Even though there was also a lot of criticism, in particular, Robert Tversky, for example, actually said, well, it's just showmanship. It's not actually more than that. But I disagree. But this is just, that there are certainly different points to it, that's for sure. Yeah. No, it's good work, and it has a lot more to it than just the things that I have to point out here. But I was trying to kind of tease out individual pieces that you can kind of reuse for other stories. Yeah.
Hi, can you talk about the tension between enabling interactivity and telling a story?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. There is, in many of the things that you see in the news media right now, in the news graphics right now, you essentially they're walking through a path. And there is a kind of and you know what you're supposed to do. You click on the next thing, right? And then, but you can also mouse over, for example, and you can sometimes click on things and then they show you some more information about that without derailing the story, but they don't let you go very far. So that's a good question. I don't actually know really how. I think that you probably want to constrain your interaction, but I don't have a complete answer to that. There's a lot of talk about interactive storytelling in computer games, but the games that actually tell a story are the ones that are very restrictive of what you can do, sorry. And the ones that don't really care about that, they just let you do whatever you want. So it tends to, I think there is a very strong tension between the two, that the more interaction there is, the more you just kind of leave it open for exploration rather than actually make it the presentation of a story. But there are people who disagree with that. So it's a very important question. I really don't have an answer to that.
Hi, Robert, and hi, everyone. My name is Evelyn. It's my first time here, and it's a wonderful presentation. So for all the four concepts you talk about, better visualization or storytelling, if you apply it to like a monthly report or whatever, and you can only have this limited amount of data, which one would you apply more for the better visualization than the other?
I think what you want is try and figure out. So a lot of that kind of reporting thing is just kind of, I'm giving you the same numbers that I gave you last month, and now you're trying to figure out how it is different. So I think a lot of that is also about what are actually teasing out the differences and turning those into the actual story, and then having like an appendix with all the numbers. That's also what we're trying to do with story points, basically saying, well, here's a workbook that has 500 sheets with all kinds of stuff, but here are the 15 most important points. And these are the actual findings. Now we walk you through that, and if you really care, you can see the rest as well. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about more here. So you really want to, so the focus, kind of the digestion, and focusing just to the actual new stuff, and how whatever you're doing differs from the previous one, or what the actual main point is. And then I guess the sequencing and stuff like that isn't quite as important, but I think the more important part is just really teasing out the actual story, the actual point, and not just giving people lots of data and having them figure it out themselves. That's a good answer, but okay.
So, in my opinion, there is a distinct difference, there's a huge difference between data presentation and data storytelling. But what I hear here is a kind of blending these two. You know, sometimes I see data presentation, sometimes I see data storytelling. In your opinion, are these two very different as well, or it's just I see it differently, you see it the same? Because I see it blended here in this.
Yeah, no, you're right. Because I haven't really found enough good examples of the storytelling part. I'm also kind of dipping into the presentation. So what I was trying to do with this talk actually is there is this whole tension in the academic visualization community about whether presentation is basically the same as analysis, which is what most academics would say, or it's an entirely different thing, which is what I say. And so what I'm trying to do here is basically tease out those things that are different in presentation. And kind of on top of that, there's also storytelling. The presentation is kind of the lower hanging fruit, and then we can get to the storytelling. So I'm not sure if they're entirely different, but storytelling but there's certainly a difference still between those two. But they're more similar than they're more similar to each other than they are to the analysis side of visualization. That's what I think.
For example, interactivity works for one and works against the other.
Right. Interactivity is one that really makes it much harder in presentations. That's exactly the good point. But you need interactivity in analysis, otherwise you just get totally lost. So I don't think that. Okay.
No? Okay. Really, really wonderfully provocative presentation. I had a question and now my question is different because of the last question. You referenced in your response to the last question, the academic response to presentation and storytelling are much the same thing. And it strikes me that that's partly because there's a confidence about who the audience is and less translation is required. That is, you're presenting to your peers, they speak the same language, less story is required because there's less of a translation gap. And as the audience gets further and further, or the audience gets more diverse, you need the story to kind of make that translation. And I'm curious, one of the best presenters on storytelling that I've seen is a guy named Jonas Sachs. I don't know if you've seen him present. He helps to run a small brand agency in San Francisco called Free Range Studios now, I think they're called. And he has a couple videos online, and he talks about the basic myths, the basic mythical stories that we tell ourselves. And his argument as a brand strategist is that the way you tell a good story to an audience to hook them is you make them the hero of the story rather than you the hero of the story. That's kind of the big idea behind it. What I like about that, what I think interests me about its connection to your work, is that he's emphasizing the fact that to tell a good story, you have to understand who your audience is. And I'm curious in your work, how you're thinking about that, the role of who the audience is in the telling of a story and the role that visualization plays in it.
So there are a couple of parts to this answer. The first thing is that in academic research, I'm not sure about, there is just this kind of assumption that you can just reuse the same techniques, the same ideas from analysis for presentation. And they've been fighting this idea of presentation for a while. Even though now, over the last 2 years or so, we've seen more actual publications coming out in that area. So that's one part of it. That has nothing to do with an audience. This is just the way things have been done for a long time. The audience part is obviously important. I mean, if you always have to know for any presentation who your audience is, and otherwise you're just not going to reach them. I'm mostly thinking about the kind of the news media type of situation, but of course you're right. You're talking to a different. So the Hans Rosling style thing, for example, isn't going to be important to do if I'm talking to people who know what aggregations are, who understand, who know the data perhaps. And so here, what he's actually doing is he's explaining what aggregation, or actually in this case disaggregation means, drilling down means, for people who just don't understand the concept or who've never really thought about it. And he's trying to tell them what it means to go from a mean to a different kind of set of means, to see all those overlaps. So that's kind of telling you something about the data that if you were an analyst you would know, but this is the point of this, is to show this to people who just have never thought about that, because they just hear stories and they never, news stories, never think about the actual details of it. So that's clearly something you would do differently if you talked to other people. But but at the same time, I'm not sure if it's, so yeah, it depends very much on who you're trying to reach. Sometimes this kind of thing can still be useful in the right kind of, with the right kind of level of subtlety, if you're trying to just get across a very subtle point about something that you just want to reinforce or make sure that people understand. So yeah, I totally agree that the audience is important, but I think that depending on who you're talking to, there are still a lot of different things that you need to get across in terms of both the data and what you're actually doing in the analysis. That's something else I wanted to say, but I forget. But yeah, anyway. Yeah.
Well, so before we go on to the next one, do you know that person personally, or do you just know?
We've met a couple times, but he's well known. His videos are on YouTube. It's Jonah S-A-C-H-S.
Well, so part of the way that we get speakers here is introductions.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Great.
I spent a lot of time creating visual interfaces, and the difference between presentation and storytelling is the presentation is about the layout, it's about the look and the feel and the design, it's about readability, and there doesn't necessarily have to be a story at all. It's just, how is the thing laid out? Can people comprehend what is actually there? Is it likable? Color, lighting, all that kind of stuff. How big are the fonts? Are they nice fonts? All that kind of stuff. So that's presentation, you're presenting. The story implies movement. Just like in a movie, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in the graphic you had of the the Congress, there was a story. There was a story in terms of there was a movement to the actual form, but a movement of data, moving in one direction or another, as opposed to just kind of there in space. And I think the problem that companies have is that when you look at data, there could be multiple stories in the same data. So the ultimate problem is, what story do you want to tell? And is there a movement, either spatially in the visualization, from one point to another, which implies the movement of the data? Do you know what I mean? Or that something is happening in time and space. And I think a lot of virtualizations fail where there's maybe a presentation which is hard to read or understand, even though there may be a story. Or there's data that's okay, presented, good, bad, and different, no story at all. Or there's too many stories. So distinguishing what your story is really important. And you may find 4 stories, and you may have 4 different virtualizations from the same data. Because data is not necessarily as black and white as I think we all sometimes would like it to be.
Okay. I think that's a good point, but of course the point, again, of stories very often is that you want to point out one. That doesn't mean that there is only one. It just means that this is the one you want to tell. And there may be reasons for that, or maybe not, but that's certainly something that's important. And, but yeah, and then of course, in terms of movement, yes, it has to be, it's at least implied, that's for sure. So there's this implied sequence, or there's a sequence that you have to point out. Whether that is through time or through some other dimension that Westman changes, or whatever it is, yeah. But that's actually the difference also between presentation and analysis. Analysis still leaves all the other stuff open, whereas presentation you want to focus on something. And even if that's 2 different things, you can say, well, we found this and we found that. But you want to be careful to not kind of overdo that, because otherwise you'll just confuse people and go too many ways, too many different directions at once.
Let's do one more.
Oh, I just wanted to echo the point about Jonas Sachs's work, and also maybe a little bit on interactivity, because when I think of storytelling, I think of like a great piece of literature will evoke emotion, and it reveals a lot about the author, and I think that speaks to like when you show the New York Times graph where you could choose which one is most like you, that would resonate to somebody who's like, oh, that's me in the story. I can see how that issue will affect me personally. And it also creates myself as a hero in that story, because I can then change, I don't know, the destiny of this person that I'm creating on the graph. So I think it's interesting that people are trying to tell stories with, data is so quantitative, and it's historically not been something that people want to make subjective, but I think the cat with the monstrous cost chart is an example of like someone not being afraid to show like what they're thinking about the data and have it be very personable and something that you can identify with as a person. There's a very human element to that that's like got soul to it.
But it's also it's obviously not trying to be impartial or just present the data. This is clearly sending the message. I think that's actually also important is to have a position here and not just kind of try and be objective or as close as possible, but have a point to make. But yeah, good points.
All right. I think we're finally exhausted all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So everybody will notice in the back, we have a different set of questions as you leave. This helps us run these events, so if you could answer the questions, we'd appreciate it. If you want to get one last thing of gelato, there's a little bit left. Please help yourself. There were two gentlemen who were looking for positions. Not only if you're looking to fulfill the positions, but if you think you can introduce somebody who can fill the position or who can help them, please just put your name in the ring and facilitate an introduction. Otherwise, thank you for coming. That's it for 2013. Have a happy New Year and a Merry Christmas.
So please throw away your
Thank you.
I've already seen
I
that.
told you to put it. I'm so excited that you